My son said he was going to the cemetery to visit his father, so I followed him. I told myself it was because I wanted to leave flowers, that it was grief, that it was tradition. But deep down, I think I followed him because hope is a stubborn thing. Even when it has been disappointed for years, it still finds a way to lift its head. I arrived with carnations in my hand and love in my chest, and I left knowing my son was already gone. My son said he was going to the cemetery to visit his father, and I believed him because believing him was easier than accepting what years of quiet disappointment had already taught me. The apartment was unusually still that morning, the kind of stillness that presses against your ears until you become aware of your own breathing. Dust floated lazily in the sunlight slipping through the heavy curtains, settling on the endless rows of books lining the walls from floor to ceiling. This place was never truly mine. It belonged to Quame, my husband, even 5 years after his death. His presence lingered in the smell of old paper, tobacco, and ink, in the massive mahogany desk that dominated the living room, and in the deep armchair molded permanently to the shape of his body. Today marked exactly 5 years since we buried him, and time had learned to move differently on this date, stretching each moment until it felt thick and heavy, like syrup poured too slowly. I brewed tea and sat at the kitchen table, my hands wrapped around the warm mug, though the warmth never reached inside me. I was waiting for them. Jabari and his wife, Niara. They never missed this anniversary, not because of grief, but because grief had proven useful. The doorbell rang sharp and sudden, slicing through the silence. Jabari entered with practiced cheer, his hug brief and awkward, his cheek rough against mine. He smelled expensive and restless. Niara followed, elegant and composed, her eyes already scanning the bookshelves as if mentally appraising each volume. She wore sorrow like a tailored coat, perfectly fitted and easily removable. I offered tea, and Jabari collapsed into his father's armchair as though testing whether it might finally accept him as its owner. Complaints followed, familiar and rehearsed, about failing deals and delayed shipments, about money trapped somewhere just out of reach. Niara spoke of a container stuck at a port, its contents allegedly worth hundreds of thousands, her gaze steady and predatory as it locked onto mine. They needed help, urgently, and they needed it from me. I listened without interruption, without reaction, because over the past 5 years something essential inside me had burned away, leaving only a dry, hollow calm. When I told them I would think about it, disappointment flickered across their faces like irritation at a machine that refused to work on command. Jabari stood and walked to the window, clasping his hands behind his back in a pose that mimicked his father so poorly it almost hurt to watch. Then he spoke of missing Quame, of how 5 years hadn't dulled the ache, of needing to go to the cemetery to sit alone and talk to him. His voice trembled, and a tear appeared, carefully released. I knew this performance. I had seen it since childhood. And still, against my better judgment, hope stirred. I wanted so desperately to believe that something sincere remained in him, that grief might reach places reason no longer could. I encouraged him softly, my voice betraying me, and he left quickly, as if afraid I might look too closely. Niara lingered just long enough to reinforce the illusion before following him out. Alone again, I stared at the quiet apartment, at the silent books and unmoving furniture, and that fragile hope began to grow roots. I changed my coat, took 3 deep red carnations from the vase meant for Quame's portrait, and called a cab from the next street so no one would notice me. During the ride, I imagined my son standing solemnly at the crypt, his head bowed, the way his father used to stand when lost in thought. Pine Ridge Cemetery welcomed me with cool air and the rustle of ancient trees. The gravel crunched softly beneath my feet as I followed the familiar path, my heart beating faster with anticipation. I was nearing the crypt when a tall, stooped man in work clothes stepped into view. Ephraim, the groundskeeper. He had worked here for years, and though we rarely spoke, I recognized him immediately. Today he did not nod politely or pass by. He approached me directly, his face tight and serious, and when he spoke my name, his voice was barely above a whisper. He placed a rough hand on my shoulder, stopping me, and told me not to go to the crypt, not yet, that I needed to see what my son was really doing. I didn't argue or ask questions. Something in his eyes told me that whatever waited ahead would change me, and I followed him along a narrow, overgrown path until we reached a small hill behind a leaning fence. From there, the family crypt was clearly visible, framed by branches and shadow. Ephraim stepped aside, granting me space, and we waited. Minutes passed, each one tightening the knot in my chest, until two figures appeared on the path. Jabari and Niara walked with purpose, no flowers in their hands, no hesitation in their steps. Jabari unlocked the heavy iron door of the crypt, and the sound echoed through the cemetery like a warning. They entered as if stepping into a storage room rather than a tomb. Soon after, a third figure approached, a man in a dark coat whose presence felt wrong even from a distance. He spoke briefly, and then Jabari and Niara emerged carrying velvet-wrapped objects, handing them over quickly, nervously. Snippets of conversation drifted toward me, words like forgery and museum and documents slicing through the quiet. My husband's resting place had become a hiding spot, a transaction point, a tool. I felt no tears, no outburst of anger. Just a sudden, crushing clarity. The man left, the crypt was locked again, and my son walked away without a single glance backward. I left the cemetery in silence, my carnations forgotten, and returned home feeling as though the world existed behind glass. Inside the apartment, everything felt staged, preserved but lifeless. I walked past Quame's desk, his chair, his books, and stopped at my own neglected corner by the window. Slowly, deliberately, I opened the lowest drawer of my desk for the first time in 30 years. Inside lay a plain wooden box. I unlocked it with the small key I had worn around my neck for decades and lifted the lid. My tools rested inside, untouched by time. A jeweler's loupe, an ultraviolet lamp, fine instruments I once used daily. Beneath them, my reference books, compiled in my own hand long before I became invisible. I held the loupe, feeling its weight, its familiarity, and something long dormant stirred awake. That night, I did not sleep. I sat in silence, staring at the box, not plotting revenge, not planning anything at all, just allowing the truth to settle fully and completely. By morning, the dust on my desk would no longer be acceptable. The morning arrived without ceremony, pale light creeping through the curtains as if uncertain it was welcome. I rose before the alarm, before habit, before memory could catch up with me. There was no heaviness in my limbs, no familiar ache of age announcing itself. Instead, there was a strange steadiness, like the calm that settles just before a storm breaks. I filled a bucket with warm water, found a clean cloth, and returned to the small desk by the window. Dust came away in gray streaks as I wiped the surface, revealing the grain of the wood beneath, scratched and worn but solid. I worked slowly, deliberately, as if each movement mattered. The geraniums were repotted, their roots freed from cramped soil, their leaves washed clean. On the small shelf above the desk sat my books, not Quame's, but mine, thin volumes and journals I had written decades ago, before marriage turned my work into a footnote. Seeing my name on the spines felt like meeting someone I had once loved and abandoned. The rest of the apartment remained untouched, preserved in its dusty reverence to my husband, but this corner was no longer a memorial. It was mine. The wooden box sat open on the desk, my tools arranged neatly beside it. I did not pick them up again, not yet. I needed no practice. Knowledge, when truly learned, does not vanish, it waits. The doorbell rang at noon, sharp and impatient. I did not hurry. When I opened the door, Jabari and Niara stepped in without waiting for an invitation, irritation already etched into their faces. There was no pretense of sorrow today. Jabari's jaw was tight, his eyes restless. Niara's politeness had thinned into barely concealed contempt. He asked immediately whether I had decided. I suggested tea. They exchanged a look, annoyed but confident, and sat. Jabari claimed his father's chair again, drumming his fingers against the armrest. Niara perched on the sofa's edge, her body angled toward the door, ready to leave the moment she got what she wanted. I moved through the kitchen with quiet precision, measuring tea leaves, slicing lemon, listening to their murmured conversation drifting in. "She's dragging this out," Niara whispered. Jabari replied with a chuckle, telling her not to worry, that I always came around in the end. I carried the tray into the living room and placed it between us. The porcelain cups clicked softly. I sat in a simple wooden chair, not my usual spot. Jabari wasted no time. He spoke of deadlines, of banks closing, of amounts too large to delay. His voice carried impatience sharpened by certainty. Niara added her own pressure, reminding me how fragile their situation was, how one transfer would solve everything. I listened, sipping my tea, letting the heat burn my tongue. When I spoke, my voice was even, curious rather than defensive. I asked Jabari about his business again, about what exactly he imported and exported. He laughed loudly, dismissively, and told me not to trouble myself with things beyond my understanding. Niara reached across the table and patted my hand, her touch cold and proprietary, advising me to think of my health instead. Their confidence was almost impressive. They believed utterly in my harmlessness. In that belief lay their greatest weakness. I looked at them, truly looked, as one might examine a flawed artifact. I told them I would help, but only if everything was done correctly, transparently, legally. Jabari rolled his eyes, saying paperwork was boring but manageable. I nodded, then asked for documents, contracts, certificates of authenticity for their merchandise. The room stilled. Niara's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she recovered, saying such things were handled by professionals. I smiled back gently and told her I was one of those professionals, or had been once. Jabari scoffed, reminding me that my career was ancient history, that times had changed. I agreed. Times had changed. People less so. I suggested they bring me samples, something tangible so I could understand their trade better. Jabari hesitated, then shrugged. There was nothing to fear from an old woman playing scholar. He promised to return the next day. When they left, I cleaned the cups carefully and returned to my desk. I opened my reference books, scanning familiar diagrams and notes, my mind slipping effortlessly back into patterns it had not used in years. That evening, Ephraim called. He did not ask how I was. He simply told me he would keep watching the crypt. I thanked him and hung up. The next afternoon, Jabari arrived alone, carrying a small case. He placed it on the table with a grin that suggested triumph. Inside lay a manuscript, yellowed pages bound in leather, convincingly old at first glance. He bragged about its value, about buyers waiting eagerly. I asked permission to examine it. He waved his hand dismissively. I took out the loupe, adjusted the lamp, and began. The act felt sacred. Fibers, pigments, ink flow, binding technique, everything told a story, and this one was sloppy beneath its disguise. I said nothing at first, letting silence stretch until Jabari grew uncomfortable. Then I asked simple questions. Where was it found? Who authenticated it? Why did the ink fluoresce under ultraviolet light in a way it shouldn't? His confidence cracked. He accused me of overthinking. I closed the case gently and told him I could not help unless everything was genuine. His face hardened. He reminded me that family helped family, that I owed him. I met his gaze without flinching and told him I owed the truth to the dead more than money to the living. He left in anger, slamming the door. That night, I slept soundly for the first time in years. Over the following days, I worked quietly. I contacted former colleagues under the guise of catching up, asking casual questions, confirming suspicions. I documented everything Jabari showed me, every inconsistency, every forgery. I did not rush. Precision mattered. Niara called repeatedly, alternating between charm and threat. I remained calm, telling her I was close to a decision. When they finally returned together, impatient and desperate, I was ready. I laid out my findings calmly, explaining the flaws in their operation, the risks, the crimes. Jabari laughed at first, then grew pale as he realized I knew far more than he expected. Niara accused me of betrayal, of choosing my husband's memory over my own son. I told her memory was not the issue. Integrity was. I said I would not give them money, but I would give them a choice. End it now, return what they could, disappear quietly, or I would take my evidence to people who would not be kind. The silence that followed was thick and heavy. Jabari stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. In that moment, the roles between us shifted, irrevocably. I was no longer the forgiving mother, and he was no longer the child. When they left, there were no threats, no apologies, just fear. I closed the door behind them and returned to my desk. The wooden box remained open, my tools gleaming softly in the afternoon light. This was not revenge, it was balance, and it was only the beginning. They did not come back the next day or the day after that. The silence stretched, unfamiliar and telling. For years, Jabari had filled my life with noise, demands, justifications, crises that required immediate attention and unconditional support. Now there was nothing. No calls, no messages. That absence confirmed what words never could. Fear had finally reached him. I did not mistake it for remorse. Fear is far more reliable. I continued my routine quietly, tending to my corner by the window, working through my notes, organizing evidence with the same care Quaim once applied to his research. Each document, each photograph, each recorded inconsistency found its place. I was not hunting them. I was simply making myself ready. A week later, Ephraim visited me for the first time. He stood awkwardly by the door, cap in hand, eyes lowered. He told me that unfamiliar men had begun appearing at the cemetery, lingering too long near the crypt, asking questions that had nothing to do with grief. He said he had refused to answer. I thanked him and asked him to continue doing exactly that. When he left, I locked the door and sat at my desk, staring at the tools laid out before me. Quaim had believed deeply in preservation, in the responsibility of truth. He used to say that history did not belong to those who owned artifacts, but to those who protected their meaning. For years, I had let his work stand alone while mine faded into the background. Now, the two were inseparable. Niara was the first to break the silence. Her voice on the phone was tight, controlled, stripped of false warmth. She accused me of poisoning Jabari against her, of meddling in things that did not concern me. I listened until she finished, then told her calmly that the cemetery had concerned me, that using a grave as a warehouse concerned me, that profiting from lies concerned me. She threatened legal action. I reminded her that threats worked best when the other party had something to lose. She hung up. That evening, Jabari called. He sounded exhausted, older somehow. He did not shout, he asked me what I wanted. The question surprised me with its simplicity. I told him I wanted the crypt emptied permanently. I wanted every forged piece accounted for and returned to whoever had been deceived, anonymously if necessary. I wanted his father's resting place sealed and respected. He laughed bitterly and told me it was impossible, that he was already too deep. I told him that depth was irrelevant when the ground beneath you had given way. I reminded him that I had not yet shared my findings with anyone outside the family. He was silent for a long time. Then he asked how much time he had. I gave him 1 month. When I ended the call, my hands were steady. The days that followed were strangely peaceful. I walked through the apartment with new eyes, no longer haunted by ghosts but accompanied by memory. I spoke to Quame aloud sometimes, not in grief but in quiet conversation, telling him what I was doing, why I had waited so long, why I could no longer wait. At the cemetery, Ephraim oversaw the clearing of the crypt. He did not ask questions. I did not explain. When the iron door closed for the final time, sealed and untouched, I placed the carnations I had carried weeks before at the threshold. They were dry and faded, but honest. On the final day of the month, Jabari appeared alone. He looked smaller, diminished by sleeplessness and loss. He told me the operation was finished, that buyers had disappeared, that partners had vanished overnight. He did not say how much he had lost. I did not ask. He asked me whether I was satisfied. I told him satisfaction was not the goal. Consequence was. He asked me whether I would report him anyway. I looked at him for a long moment, seeing not the man he had become, but the boy he once was, the one who had asked endless questions in his father's study, who had loved stories before he learned how profitable lies could be. I told him that the choice was no longer mine alone. He would live with what he had done regardless of what I chose. I told him I would remain silent as long as he remained clean. If he crossed that line again, I would not warn him. He nodded, accepting terms he had no power to negotiate. When he left, I felt no triumph, no relief, only completion. Months passed. My name began to circulate quietly in academic circles again, attached to consultations, authentications, discreet investigations. I worked from my desk by the window, sunlight warming the wood, geraniums thriving beside me. I never returned to the rest of the apartment. Quame's space remained untouched, a monument rather than a prison. Sometimes I thought of the woman I had been before marriage, before motherhood, and I realized she had not vanished. She had simply waited. One afternoon, as I catalogued a genuine manuscript for a small museum, I felt a familiar calm settle over me. Not cold this time, but clear. I understood then that the cemetery had not been the place where I lost my son. It was where I buried an illusion, and in doing so, I reclaimed myself.